Good afternoon and welcome to the Let's try that again. Good afternoon and welcome to the Thomas and Collier book study number 1. Today we're excited to be talking about chapters 1 and chapter 2, and we appreciate all of you being here. Please take just a second and raise your hand once again to let me know that you are actually able to hear me. Fantastic. So today in the room, you have me, Ivana Manthor-Anderson, one of the co-leads for the DLI team and this book study, along with Dr. Anne-Marie Gunter, who is with World Languages. Today we're going to be talking about our welcome and overview, going into some reflections and discussions on Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, which are actually modules 3 and 4 in the Canvas study, and then we'll have wrap up and next steps. We're very excited to have you back together again. We know there were a few of you who were not able to join us last time, so we will spend a little bit of time in this broadcast going over some of the logistics, such as the meeting tools that we're working with here in GoToMeeting. So you will see a number of things in your control panel. You have your audio. Hopefully you've already figured that out, but we know sometimes we have audio issues as we go through a broadcast. So if you do have trouble with your audio, one thing to consider is unplugging your headset and plugging it back in, and often that will reset it. And of course, a phone call is always an option as well. We know that many of you have already discovered your hand. We also know that sometimes hands raise on their own. So throughout the broadcast, we may be asking you to raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted. And if you do get called on and your hand is kind of going wild, we will try to take note of that and not put you on the spot. But please keep an eye on your hand. You can raise it and lower it. And there's always the question box where you can add questions for us to be able to read out if you don't want to unmute yourself, or for us to be able to answer throughout the broadcast. This broadcast is being recorded. We do our best to have all of our recordings up within a week from the broadcast, but since this book study does meet weekly, we will do our best to have this up within the next 2, if not 3 days. So as we've mentioned in the past, but we're very excited and want to mention again that this Blue Book study is the first of a series of studies on the books that have been written by Drs. Wayne Thomas and Virginia Collier. Many of you may be familiar with them, and many of you may not. So once we have completed this Blue Book study, we'll be moving on to the Red Book, which focuses on North Carolina in Chapter 5, and then moving on through each of the other books to grow in our understanding of working with dual language immersion, just as the authors grew in their understanding through each of these separate books.
All right. So before we get into our discussion today, we want to talk with you about a few logistical things, including the Canvas portion of our book study. Most of you are very familiar with this screenshot, I think, our Blue Book course in Canvas, the Thomas and Collier book study number 1. And so we wanted to share that with you and remind everyone that you need to get enrolled. You have been sent instructions, and you need to follow those so that you are enrolled in the Canvas portion of the book study by this Thursday, October 10th. If you're having problems with that, please send us screenshots and things of what you're seeing, because in the next slide, you'll also notice that when you enroll, you have to choose either the 1 CEU section of the book study or the 2 CEU section of the book study. Clearly, the difference is there's a little bit more work involved in the 2 CEU section. We'll get into that a little bit later, but just in general, everybody's doing the same things when it comes to our synchronous sessions like we're here today. So whether you're the 1 CEU section and 2 CEU section, everyone's together for the synchronous sessions. But in the book study, if you want to earn that extra CEU for licensure renewal, then you need to be doing quizzes and discussion forum postings for all of our readings. And so that's something that the 2 CEU section participants really need to pay attention to and work on. And so we wanted to remind you just that those are happening, so that you know what you're looking for. Obviously, these look very similar in your Canvas section, but they are a little bit different for that reason. Another thing to keep in mind is that we actually are sort of pioneers with using Canvas in this way for a statewide book study or course. And that means also that we are getting better at making sure you have the instructions you need to enroll in the correct section, 1 CEU or 2 CEUs, but also that when we encounter problems, we can usually quickly, easily solve them. So again, make sure you're enrolled in the Canvas section by this Thursday if you haven't already. If you encounter problems, please send us a note, but include a screenshot of the error you're receiving so we can help you quickly. Obviously, here on the screen is our book study timeline. We wanted to remind you that there are 6 synchronous sessions. Those are on Tuesdays from 4 to 5:30 p.m. We did our first one last week, so that one's crossed off the list already, and we are currently on October 8th. We do have 4 more after this. Next week we'll be with you on October 15th, and then we skip a week because there's no meeting on Tuesday, October 22nd. And then we resume on October 29th, November 5th, and then we finish up on November 12th with our synchronous sessions. If you have to miss a synchronous session for some reason, and you're listening to a recording of this, please know that there is a makeup assignment because everyone is being graded on their participation in our synchronous sessions. But if you do have to miss, there's a makeup assignment for you to make up those points completely. So just follow the instructions on the syllabus for the synchronous session that you need to make up. Finally, we wanted to share with you some things we've learned about you as learners. It's always good to know your students, and we have taken a look at the visual introductions you have posted in both sections of our course, and we want to share with you sort of the summary of that information so that you have it and know who each of you are as diverse learners in our course. So the first comparison we made was that you've lived in a lot of places. We have people in this course that have lived in Argentina, Honduras, Panama, and in various places across the United States.
Those are actually places people come from.
Oh, come from.
Yeah, they've
Sorry.
lived in many, many, many.
Oh.
We've both been going through, sorry to interrupt, but we've both been going through your responses. And so Argentina, Honduras, Panama, and USA are where I was able to glean that people actually come from. Mm-hmm. So I may have missed a few. Let me apologize.
And don't worry, that's something you can always include in your visual introduction if you think it's important to share that. But it's really up to you what you include in your visual introduction. Next up are all the languages that we have, all the linguistic diversity. We have people who speak and or teach these 10 different languages: Chinese, and mainly Mandarin Chinese, English, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. Our teaching assignments vary from being content teachers like general education teachers to being dual language immersion or DLI teachers. We have some exceptional children or EC teachers, English as a second language or ESL teachers, heritage language teachers who are teaching a world language like Spanish, but to native speakers of that language, migrant teachers assigned to that particular population, and world language teachers. So a variety of those as well. Our grade levels in schools go from elementary up through post-secondary. We have elementary teachers, middle school and high school, charter school teachers, community college instructors, and district office administrators. We also have different roles people are taking on. Almost everyone is a teacher, either currently on assignment or has been in the past. We also have some lead teachers in the group and a variety of administrators at different levels. And finally, the experience in this group, again, according to our visual introductions, varies from brand new teachers to over 20 years. And I know from some of our discussions that some people are even approaching the retirement time frame, although honestly, not a lot of people actually retire in our profession. So they may continue to be contributors and maybe even someday be involved in teaching courses like this as part of their retirement opportunities.
So we really have enjoyed getting to know you through those visual introductions. It also looks like you've enjoyed getting to know each other. I saw lots of responses, and you can continue to upload those if you have not uploaded them already. So just a reminder at the bottom of this screen is as we go through, at any point, please put your responses in the question box, and you can also raise your electronic hand to be unmuted and to share your ideas. The idea of this book study is for us to all talk together, learn together, and work together. I don't want to lose my voice by talking all the time. So we really look forward to continued participation. So we are going to start with a poll question. And the first poll question is, what did you find when you examined linguistically diverse students' demographics in North Carolina and across the United States? And you can choose all that apply. So some of these statements kind of are opposite of each other. Students differ greatly across the state in the US, or students are quite similar across the state and US. The students I serve are similar to the state. As a whole, the students I serve are different, and I'm not sure, but eager to hear or discuss. So has that poll been launched?
We are working on that.
Ah, here we go.
All right, remember this is check all that apply, check that all that you would like to respond. And you can easily check your answers just by clicking the answers on the screen. It's sort of a touch screen, if you will, almost.
Looks like they're getting a lot quicker with the polls.
Indeed. We have over half right now. We'll take about 5 more seconds to finish out. Remember, participating in the polls is one way to make sure you earn your points for our broadcasts, our synchronous sessions. All right, we'll close that out and share the results with you. And it looks like well over half of you agreed with 2 of the statements. Students differ greatly across the state and the US, and the students I serve are similar to the state as a whole. We also had about a quarter of people saying students are quite similar across the state and the US, and a little over 10% saying the students I serve are different than the state, or I'm not sure but eager to hear the discussion. So quite a variety there, and of course it depends on the community you're in and what students you're working with currently.
So thank you so much for completing that poll and sharing that information. So also following up on that poll is our first connections question. You might recognize the pictures from the connections in the actual module. So we want to know from you, either by unmuting you or having you type into the question box, how do the North Carolina demographics for ELS compare with your own learning environment? And then what impact does this have on your work with students and educators? So I am looking for raised hands.
And I'm looking for answers to be put in the questions box.
And we know sometimes it takes you a little while to get warmed up. That's why we like to start with that poll question so that you start thinking. All right, Carlos, I see your hand. I'm going to unmute you. Can you hear me, Carlos?
Yes, how you doing?
Great, how are you?
Good. Okay, I would like to point out something very interesting, especially in the I work in Duplin County, and the school, and I hate to talk about races, but the school that I work at was majority white school, and I have seen over the years, I've been teaching at the same school like for the last 10 years, and I have seen how the numbers of immigrant students has been growing and growing, and now in a school that we were predominantly white, we are already 54 or 53% Hispanic now. So I can see how this influx of students are coming to America has impacted our school, our community. I'm telling you, our community especially, it's very interesting to see. And then you can see in the graph, you know, Duplin County above 31% of students whose primary language is other than English. So it is really impacting our system right now.
So that didn't surprise you when you saw that on the map, huh?
Not at all. I see it every day. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to mute you.
And from the question box, Emily has noted that just as in North Carolina, her demographic of students is primarily US-born Spanish-speaking students. She continued on that they have a larger influx this year of children from Honduras in particular, and more newcomers this year than in the last several years. So that's kind of interesting.
It is. Do you want to do another question box?
Sure. Martha says, our demographics in Durham are similar to those statewide, mostly Latinx, but with a variety of other languages represented.
I see Shweta's hand is up. Shweta, you are self-muted. I've unmuted you on my end. If you'd like to talk, please unmute yourself. You should have a microphone icon with a little line through it. Just click on that and it will unmute you. There you go.
Yeah. So I just want to say with the lady from Durham who spoke just now, who wrote about the Durham population, since I work at a charter school in Durham, the demographics are very similar to the state of North Carolina in the sense that we have a lot of inborn immigrant population identified in the program, and also we have an influx of new students coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. In fact, I have like 6 newcomers in 6th and 7th grade today. I mean this school year, sorry. So having said that, I feel that the demographics are very similar. We are a charter school that has about 60%, 50 to 60% population is Hispanic. And so, and the EL identified students are about 36 to 37% of students in my school are ELs. So we have a very high population. So I would say that resonates with the demographics of the state.
Okay, thank you for sharing. I'm going to mute you. And then you guys, once you have raised your hand, if you would put your hand back down, unless you have additional comments you'd like to share. Emery?
So in the questions box, Catherine says she was surprised when she first came to Henderson County that there's such a large variety of international backgrounds in a rural area. Now she better understands this is due to agriculture, factory, and service workers in the area.
So lots of different reasons. Great.
Veronique says she was very impressed by the areas reaching over 30% of homes having a home language other than English. It seems like a tremendous number to her when you think about those demographics.
I'm looking for additional hands.
Emily, a different Emily this time, says she's seen a large enrollment of English learners over the past years. She shared that with her teammates, the map of languages in all of the counties, because she thought that would help them as well.
Fantastic.
Stephanie also commented on the map. She said she's in Sampson County, and with the students that they have, the map definitely did not surprise her at all.
I think these maps, and I only put one of them on the slide, but I think these maps are very telling when you look at, they're called heat maps, when you look at where the heat is or where the larger concentrations are across the state. And when you do compare those two maps, sometimes you'll see that there may be a larger number in one area, but a larger percentage in another area of students with diverse languages. Let's see, got a shy group today, typing but not talking. Go ahead.
Marcella says she's seen an influx of English learner students from the end of the last school year and the beginning of this school year, and that's only a few months. The population of linguistically diverse students has increased similarly to the increased population in the state.
Very interesting, and I'm looking at our chart realizing that we need to go ahead and update that with our 1819 count, and our 1819 count did go up to over 106,000. So we know that we again are on this trend, and at some point we're going to have to drop off that 2002 and start taking off some of those dates. But we really wanted you to see the initial growth of ELs and then how it tapered off a little bit and then how it's grown again. And some of you mentioned reasons already why there might be changes in the demographics and the population. Let's see.
Elizabeth said her county is becoming more and more linguistically diverse. Their numbers of English learners seem to come in waves across 3 or 4 years, and then her supervisor seems to attribute it to changes in attitudes towards immigrants in their community.
So be interested in hearing more of that, because I was just going to say, how does this impact the work with the students and educators? And so in your environment, whether it's the school environment or the community, how does this change impact what you're doing with your students, what you're doing as educators? Many of you are ESL teachers, but many of you are content area teachers or in administrative roles. How does this change in demographics impact what you're doing?
Kenneth added that the North Carolina demographics for Wake County, where he's at, are similar to what his charter school has in Wake County, but that also the increase makes it imperative to have resources and trained staff to serve this increasing population of students.
Okay. And then that's something we will continue to talk about throughout this book study is where do you find those resources? How do you get the staff that's qualified? And then how do you train that staff? So that will come up some in this book study and in future book studies as well. I see Shweta's hand up. I don't know if it's a new comment. I'm going to unmute you again. I'm going to try to. Yes, did you have another comment?
Yes, I do. I believe that the state demographics and the diversity that is represented around in the area where you teach, and especially with the content and the context of your teaching, it absolutely impacts you as a teacher. Well, me just being an ESL teacher, it has impacted my growth as a teacher, as well as the content area teachers are becoming obviously overtly concerned about how to better serve this EL population that is growing every day in the school. So they're very concerned about their language needs, and they want to implement the right tools and techniques to help the kids in the classroom.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see if we have any other hands. Oh, Giovanna, I'm unmuting you. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, one of the things that I would like to add also is that some of these students that are just coming in, especially from Guatemala, they have no schooling, and that is something that has been affecting our school system this year more than anything, because in the past, the student has been in school, you know, have some schooling experience, but these other ones from Guatemala, they have not been schooled. They don't even know how to write their name. They don't know the number. So even at the high school level, we have some students like that. So that has been really challenging for the teachers, not only ESL teacher, but homeroom teacher also.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I was in Charlotte Mech and we had the Bantu students that came in, it was the same kind of situation. You had students who'd had no schooling, even at the high school level, and people often did not know what to do to help those students. Hey, what do you have, Anne-Marie?
There's several comments here. Allison commented that in her school, the demographics are similar to the North Carolina demographics. The majority of students are US-born ESL students coming from Spanish-speaking homes, but the US-born Arabic-speaking students come next as far as the demographic numbers.
So a lot of US-born, and that is one of the things that often surprises people not in our field when we talk about demographics in North Carolina, that approximately 85% of our kindergarten students are born in the, of our kindergarten EL students are born in the United States.
We also have Katie commenting that she's in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, and they have a very similar demographic situation that described in Durham before.
Mm-hmm.
So urban areas tend to have some similarities then.
Do you want to do one or two more before we move on to the next question?
Sure. Here's an interesting one because they mentioned they're an outlier. Caleb says that his school and his county seem to be an outlier when it comes to Western North Carolina. The impact that this has on his work with his students and fellow educators is that he's noticed an influx of both students who are foreign-born English learners as well as American-born students who speak English as a second language. This has had a profound impact on his work with fellow educators, as he has to work closely with schools' English learner specialists to help integrate course content to meet those students' needs.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of the English learner students that he's seeing come from Mexico, whereas others are new arrivals from Honduras and Puerto Rico.
All right, very diverse. You want to pick one more?
Yes. Here's another one from the western side of the state. Joanna says the demographics in Haywood County are very similar to many other rural counties in North Carolina. Being new to the western part of North Carolina, she was curious to know the reason for a large number of English learner students in Henderson County. And she goes on with further comments that she's still typing. So it is interesting to really look at those demographics and think about not only what are the changes over time, but why are things changing? What are the connections to the community with different industries coming in or going out of the community, with things changing for the adults in our workforce, and how that impacts our students in schools.
Fantastic. So every year, those heat maps are updated. And every year, eventually we update that chart that shows you the bars of EL student growth. If you join us for different presentations around the state, you'll often see this information, and we typically also have it posted on the website. So now we're going to move into a question specific to Chapter 1. Again, you can type in the question box, or we would love to hear your voice. So we always want to look at what are the authors saying and how do we respond to that. So our authors state that students whose first language is not English are the fastest growing demographic group in public schools, and that schools are dramatically undereducating this group. So do you agree or disagree, and why? Let's give a second for people to type. And once again, if you want me to unmute you, please raise your hand. I see a hand up. Catherine, I'm unmuting you. Can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I was reflecting on this question earlier, and I would have to say that I get the feeling that they are being undereducated, probably due to a lack of resources and perhaps funding. We are seeing such a great influx, and as an EL teacher, sometimes it feels nearly impossible to do the many tasks that we have before us.
Thank you for sharing.
And we have several in the questions box saying they agree with what Catherine just said, that sometimes it's a matter of knowing that there's more of a need there, but not necessarily having the resources that you wish you had to serve students.
And part of what we'll be looking at throughout this book study is how do we better serve our English learners? And we'll be discussing exactly what you're talking about. How do we have those resources? I see Gabriela. You're self-muted, Gabriela, if you could unmute yourself. It says Gabriela cannot take control. Let me try again.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we got it.
Okay. Yes, I agree. And I think another reason that I'm seeing is that it is lack of funding, but it is also the mindset of how to better service our ELL population. There's this mindset of, how we traditionally used to service them, like pulling them out, but I think there's got to be a new change on how we service them as a school, not just the ESL teachers, but also the classroom teachers, and providing them with training and providing them with tools to be able to better service those students in the classroom. And I think part of the issues and part of the problems is those teachers not being trained on how to better service them and how to better understand the process of language acquisition. So I think we make a change in that, we can better service them and being able to educate them properly or to provide them with the tools for success.
Thank you. And I think you touched on several different things. One of the important ones being that whole mindset. How did we educate ELs in the past versus what are some other options we may have now that we didn't have before? And you mentioned pullout. And as we get further into the Thomas and Collier book study, we'll begin to see some of their graphs and some of the research that they've conducted and what their findings are and the impact of different kinds of services. So the professional development, even if it's available, may or may not be the answer if there's a mindset that's not prepared for the demographic shift. So thank you very much.
We have a comment too in the question box, several actually along the same lines. Rachel and several others have noted that schools are undereducating this group due to lack of funding and positions. She notes that in rural areas especially, the world language teachers and the ESL teachers are stretched thin and overworked, and they're often being asked to interpret, to translate, and to contact parents in addition to teaching their students or additional classes that they have.
So looking at all the ways they can use their staff, but then wondering, is the staff being pulled maybe from a teaching moment in order to do some translating and things? So we do hear about that in the field. I see Giovanna's hand up. You're self-muted.
Well, my hand was up accidentally, but I can participate because I agree. Not only because there is not enough, funding, but because there is not enough personnel to cover all the amount of students that we have in the schools. And even though DPI says that the ESL teacher or the ESL TA is not supposed to be doing translation and interpretation and phone call and all that good stuff, we work for the school, and if the principal calls you and tells you that you have to do this or have to do the other, who are we to say no? They are our boss. So in many instances, we have to send the students back to class and do what our boss tells us to do. And we are serving these kids because this is precious time that they are, losing. And in addition, the pull-out model, according to our book, is not the best model, but that's the one that we mostly use here in North Carolina. And I wish in county like mine, Samson County, that you can see that little map that you were showing there, it was like the dark green.
Mm-hmm.
A dual Spanish program over here will be the answer to many questions. And for not only the teachers, the schools, and the students and parents and everybody would benefit from something like that. But I don't know if it is because we are in a rural area, the people who are taking the decision, making decisions, they don't see the importance of having a dual language immersion program here. Never. I have been here 20 years and no one has ever, thought about it or.
Well, it sounds to me like someone has thought about it because you're talking about it now. So a great part of this book study will be the information that you glean from these discussions, from the readings. Maybe you can encourage some other people to take the next round of the course and begin going down that road of trying to get some things started there in Sampson County. So thank you so much for sharing. And if you check your hand thing, you can put it down because I will keep calling on you if it's up. So go ahead, Emery.
Let's take a few more from the questions box. To tack on to some of the things we talked about with resources and time and so forth, Martha notes that though those are issues, teachers really have good intentions. And even if they lack some of the things they want to serve their students, they really give it their best to make sure it happens every day for as many students as possible. And that is really important to think about. We also have a couple people, Marcella, Carlos, and others saying that sometimes there's also some challenges within a community. Some communities are very open to newcomers, let's say, or to people who bring linguistic diversity to the community, really value that. And other communities are a bit more hesitant when it comes to welcoming new members of their community, including students. And that's something that, again, we're seeing in schools, and the teachers are doing their best to try to change to benefit students.
Mm-hmm. And so as we're going through the slides, we realize that sometimes we might not get to all the hands that are up or to all the questions that have been typed, but most of these questions sort of fishtail into each other, and so, or dovetail, what's it called? Anyway, they go together. So if you aren't able to get a comment in on one question, perhaps when the next question comes up, you'll have the opportunity to even add more to what you were thinking. So we are going to go on to our next chapter 1 question that says, how has this linguistic diversity transformed U.S. or North Carolina schools? So we've touched on this some already, but we wanted you to think about some of the things that they talk about in chapter 1 and even more in chapter 2 with the legislation, with the growing population, with the diversity among our Ls. You mentioned those who've had former schooling, those who have not. And then what length of time does it take to accomplish that fluency? So give you a chance to dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that you've already started saying. I see that Swetha's hand is up.
Hi, Ivana. Hi. So I just wanted to quickly add here that absolutely the linguistic diversity has transformed our country and the state. especially with considering how many immigrants come to the country, how many students are learning this first, I mean, as their second language. And of course, we know the contextual and the other factors involved in second language acquisition. So, I mean, if you go by the theory, if you go by the numbers, the data, all of that put together, like comprehensive information, I believe there are a lot of factors that will absolutely assist and help a student acquire a language within, within the period of like 7 to 8 years of, being in these U.S. schools. So I absolutely feel that this diversity has transformed our country and the state. And considering myself as well, I mean, I didn't get to speak in the beginning about our backgrounds, like how diverse we were. Like I was born and raised in India until the age of 23. I'm a master's in English literature. I taught in India for 2 years. I went to the UK to study my second master's in TESOL, and I taught there. And then I came to US in 2008. So consider that. I've lived in 3 different countries, and now I'm an American. And of course, I've been teaching here for the last 11 years in US schools. So, I mean, we ourselves are diverse as teachers. So
Yes.
I speak like 3 languages at the same time, multilingual. So, I mean, my students are obviously bilingual, and they also bring their cultural experiences, linguistic experiences, their social, emotional experiences, educational experiences, and all of that. And it's not just me, but the content area teachers also, I feel, have to have the similar understanding about these needs of these particular students. So I absolutely believe that the needs are changing. We have to become better aligned, and it's absolutely contributed to the diversity of the country even further.
Thank you.
So we have a couple people talking about how legislation has impacted things here. And Gabriella feels it has, legislation in different cases have impacted what we do in terms of regulation, programs, and funding. And it's still changing and evolving, actually. We also have a person, Veronique, commenting that the legislation is a good start, but there's so much more to do. There are more people coming within different social contexts, so the legislation needs to adapt. And the studies regarding second language acquisition are essential because those are good resources for schools and educators.
Fantastic. 1 or 2 more?
Elizabeth says she thinks this linguistic diversity has forced us in the field to look more closely at our goals. At the same time, she finds herself expanding her strategies to accommodate the goals of a varied student body. And it's good for the students to see that there's more than one way to be bilingual or linguistically diverse.
And that's a very interesting point. There's more than one way. And so some of you may be familiar with Linguafolio, and if you're not, you will be later on in the book study, and looking at ways that our students can really take charge of their own learning and evaluating where they are on the continuum of bilingualism. So often if someone says, are you bilingual, we think, oh, you have to be fluent in another language. But we want to all be emerging bilinguals as we're working with our different languages and our experiences.
There are also several people commenting about different types of programs, how long it takes to close that linguistic gap, and several who comment on the fact that they think that dual language immersion or DLI programs has really paved the way to a very different type of educational opportunity for students.
All right, and as we get into chapter 2, we'll talk some more about the legislation and the impact that it has on our students. So at this point, we want to take a few minutes in chapter 1 for your questions or your thoughts. Are there things from the chapter that we haven't highlighted with the questions that we've asked, or things you want to go more deeply into? So this is your opportunity to really guide where we go with this discussion. And I'm going to say we could take maybe about 5 to 8 minutes before we go on to the next chapter.
And since it's going to be questions that you're thinking up and that others aren't necessarily having the same thoughts on, why don't you type your actual question into the question box so that we can share it from there. All right, Sandra noted that she thinks it's important to know the origin of the terminology we frequently use when referring to English learners. Knowing your history, if you will, helps you shape the future, of course, and knowing that terminology is always important in what we do.
So as we know, there's a lot of interesting terminology out there, and just when we look at the legislation going from LEP, Limited English Proficient, to EL, English Learner, and in the research we often hear things like multilingual learners. So there's a lot of different words and acronyms and things that are used, and as you said, the etymology of that or the history behind that may give you some insight into the times when those particular terms were coined.
Emily has noted that there was a quote that really caught her attention in chapter 1. She said that the quote that struck her the most was, "Our goal is to prepare them for their future, not for what exists now." She thinks this is a critically important view as we're striving to develop fully bilingual students for a global community.
So we'll take a second to see if anyone wants to be unmuted or type a response to that. Preparing our students for their futures, not necessarily for what we have now. We get anything in response to that?
Not exactly in response to that, but Carlos has a question. He says, besides looking at the influx of numbers and the changes like that over time, what do we hear about these same issues in other developed countries where there are immigration issues like we have here, but they embrace bilingualism as part of all students' education?
That's a very interesting question. So you can continue to put your questions in the chat box. You can respond to a question in the chat box. That's a little harder for us to follow sometimes, but we're trying. And you are free to raise your hand to share information.
So it looks like Marcella has posted a response to the question about how do you prepare students for their future, not what currently exists. And her comment was, the better we prepare our current diverse students in their mother language and their second language, the more prepared they're going to be for their adulthood, whatever that is going to look like in the future.
Very interesting. One or two more, if they're there. Otherwise, we'll move on to chapter 2.
We have some people commenting on the data. People seem sort of intrigued. Gabriella says the most recent data from the book is from 2015, and it made her look into more recent data and legislation. And she sees how different programs are in other states and how we address this here in North Carolina. So that is something sort of interesting to consider, comparatively speaking.
So be interested in knowing a little bit more about specifically what aspect of the data you or other people in the book study are looking at. On page 4, we see the graph that talks about the achievement gap. And it talks about when you just look at the curve as a whole, you don't really see the full picture. But when you break it out by the subgroups, native English speakers or former English learners, you really begin to see that achievement gap. And that makes me think of MTSS here in North Carolina. And when we talk about MTSS and meeting the needs of 80% of your students in their content classrooms, you also have to really drill down into the subpopulations, because that 80% of the whole, it may be, yes, you're meeting the 80%, but then when you look at your subpops, are you meeting your EC needs? Are you meeting your ESL needs? And so thinking about that data. So be really curious to know a little more about the data.
And Martha's commented on that too. She says, in looking at that particular graph and others, it's discouraging that students initially show growth, but then tend to plateau, and the achievement gap widens as they reach middle and high school.
All right, and double the work. is what our students have, and that's something you'll be learning about in one of our other modules as well, a publication called Double the Work, and how we can't remediate our L's. We have to make sure that they are learning more in a year than your typical student is, because as Thomas and Collier say, those English learners, those native English speakers aren't waiting for the ELs to catch up. Awesome.
And to kind of close out our discussion about data and what some of these charts show, Shweta asks, why are we not encouraging dual language immersion in our classrooms and schools to meet the needs of all learners, and certainly English language learners? And actually, Shweta, part of that answer is part of this book study, particularly in other chapters. And you're going to see that North Carolina in particular has been encouraging the growth of DLI programs across the state to serve all learners. And it's actually a national movement as well. So hopefully that data will look a little better to you as you start to see what's happening very recently in our schools.
I think that's one of the reasons too that it's so important for us to not just do the Blue Book, but to do the entire series, because as I said at the beginning, the researchers themselves learned and grew as they did this research, and so you'll see that in the books that follow. All right, let's shift on over to chapter 2. Again, if you weren't able to get a comment in or we weren't able to read yours, please know that all these things do work together, and we look forward to hearing from you as we go into the U.S. policy context. So we are going to do another poll question. What connections, and this is from one of your objectives for chapter 2, what connections did you find between legislation requirements and actual practices for educating our English learners? And you've touched on some of this already. So again, some of these kind of are opposites. Legislation was created because of gaps in EL services. EL services have improved greatly due to the legislation, or maybe they haven't improved much based on the legislation. EL services vary greatly despite the legislation, or I'm really not sure, but I want to hear some more. And you can choose all that apply.
All right, that poll is out. Go ahead and click on your responses. Looks like we're almost done getting responses. It'll take another 10 seconds. Let everybody finish out.
And it's 1 point they get for participating in these polls?
Right, but out of a total of 10, so it works all together to get a total of 10 for the assignment. All right, we're going to close out and then share the responses with you. As you can see, 80% of you said L services vary greatly despite legislation. 2/3 of you, or 67%, say that legislation was created because of gaps in L services. Almost half of you, 47%, said that L services have improved greatly due to legislation. And 20% said you're not sure, but you're eager to hear the discussion. And just 7%, so maybe only 1 or 2 of you, say L services have not improved much based on legislation. So there has been improvement overall. So legislation is driving some changes.
And I think Shweta said something about that earlier as well. So that legislation is important, but it's not necessarily the answer or the fix it for all. So when you looked at the connections in chapter 2, you learn a little bit about ESSA, and you have some links and the opportunity to explore much more deeply. No Child Left Behind is what was in place when this book was written. So what you read about in the book are different aspects of No Child Left Behind, and that came out in 2001. It took until 2015 before the ESEA, which is the actual original legislation. Each time it's reauthorized, it's given a new name. And so someone said how it's important to look at the naming of things. So we went from No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds in 2015. And so depending on what your role is, you may or may not even realize that there's been a change in legislation. And then there are others of you that may be keenly aware of the change in legislation because it impacts maybe what you're doing in a daily basis in your schools. So what differences, if any, have you seen in EL education since ESSA or ESSA came into effect? And I think they like hearing our voice because they keep typing.
We'll give everybody a moment to put their thoughts together if they do want to type something in the questions box. We do have one person, Catherine. We have 4 Catherines, by the way. Some can be spelled with a C and some with a K. Say that the L subgroups count for testing. And that's one of the differences she's seen with the ESSA.
Yes, so the accountability rules and guidelines in North Carolina are different under ESSA. In the past, we had AMAOs, and the L subgroup sort of was measured on its own, and now it is actually included in the overall calculations for the state as a whole. And so that does impact our schools in a different way.
We have a couple people who said both NCLB and ESSA have really made teachers pay more attention to the needs of their English learner students and how they're serving those needs.
So that would be an example of how legislation has positively impacted EL education. I don't know if we have any data geeks out there, but one of the big changes going to ESSA from No Child Left Behind, going back to the comment about accountability, is that in the past with the AMAOs, accountability was at the district level. And now accountability is at the school level. So as far as the professional development that we're offering, trying to make sure that principals are aware, that teachers are aware. We've always wanted the EL students to have their needs met, but this is just another way that the legislation has sort of put the spotlight on our students.
And to follow that, Allison notes that she believes more building administrators are paying attention to English learners because you're seeing more of a drill down to the building level.
Okay.
Emily also noted that it seems to her there's more pressure on exiting students quicker than in the past. And that pressure trickles down to the teachers, even though the research that she's read states it takes a minimum of 5 to 10 years to develop.
So if you don't mind, I'd love a follow-up on that about what you mean by pressure to exit more quickly. How is that pressure being felt? Where do you feel it's coming from? In the ESSA legislation, we were required in our state plan to indicate the number of years that a student would have to exit based on their entry. So when they come in, they take the placement test, then they take that first access test. Based on that access test score, where on the continuum would that student be in the number of years they have to exit? So that was required in the ESSA plan. But I'm very curious to hear what kind of pressures are being put on people, because at this point, you know, there are some sort of repercussions based on the way calculations are done. And what does that mean to us?
Caleb notes that he's not seen many measurable effects in his transition from teaching in South Carolina to teaching in North Carolina. He's wondering about how consistent the goals are across the country, and maybe are they measured in the same ways and enforced in the same ways and enforced effectively, and how does that look?
All right, well, it is quite different across the country. People had the ability to make a number of choices. And I know that in the Thomas and Collier book, they talked in chapter 1 about it would be great that when there is reauthorization, that certain things are attended to. I'm trying to find the page. I didn't mark that one. But they talk about 3 things that should be done when there was reauthorization. One of them was longitudinal study. And the other 2, if I can find it, are things that really what they did in the ESSA law is they left it to the states to make those decisions. So if anybody can find that page number, maybe it was in chapter 2. If anybody can find my page number, But when they created the laws, they did not answer those questions. I found at page 12, chapter 2. So our authors say that there should be longitudinal comparisons following the same students across time. So of course, Thomas and Collier have done that, but we don't know how much that was taken into account when ESSA was created. The second one that they suggested, the third one was English learners should be tested in their primary language for high stakes or accountability purposes. And that is something that the ESSA plan did ask all states to indicate what kind of tests were available in students' native languages, how they were being used. Why am I having trouble finding second? Second, that just as you just said, that there's conclusive research that 3 years is not enough for a typical English learner to close that gap. So again, the federal government in the ESSA plan asked the states to make those determinations. Now, sometimes when the states made a determination, the federal government came back and said, no, that's not good enough. We think you need to be more stringent in your decisions. But we hope that by having that continuum of when students should exit, and that is set actually at the school level based on the individual student data, we're hoping that that helps us to talk to our administrators, to talk to our content teachers, and to help everyone get on board with finding ways within that MTSS structure to meet the needs of all of our students.
So getting back to the pressures on teachers, we've got several people commenting on that. One of the things they're saying is that part of ESSA, they think, that is that there's been more staff employed to aid in helping English learners. There's more TAs, there's more teachers, there's more happening that way. However, there's still a lot of testing, and teachers are very anxious about the scores and how they'll affect the way they are perceived as teachers. There are also people who feel that the targets set are unreasonable and unfair, and that people are probably under stress or anxious because they feel they're being held accountable for something that may be unattainable based on the research we have.
Okay, and that is much appreciated feedback. And I will say that one of the things that we have talked about with the WIDA access test is looking at those exit scores, because we know that the test went from a paper and pencil test to an online test. And then there was some standards resetting within WIDA that made the test actually more rigorous. And so those are things that we have heard from you in the field, and those are things that we are listening to and discussing. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to move forward to make changes in a way that you all feel are more appropriate.
Yeah, and then there's some questions around that, by the way. How can, for example, and there's variations on this theme. So how can DPI, my district, my school, my community get on board with these ideas from the federal level and with helping English learners?
Wow, well, I have several thoughts on that, especially if you're talking on the federal level, and we can put some information online. I don't think we have it anywhere right now. There's an organization that works directly with the government and advises things. They're not the only group out there that does that, but this is an organization that any of you are welcome to join. I'm the immediate past president of that organization, and Deborah Wilkes, who is in Cumberland County, is a new board member as an LEA representative. So there's quite a voice there. So one thing we could do certainly is give you a connection to me, but especially to Deborah Wilkes as a representative on that board, that she can hear your voice and take those things to that group. So that would be one way to get involved. Another way to get involved more locally is the conversations we're having right now, and also the ELAC, which is the English Language Advisory Council. That group, Sweta is on that group. I'm trying to look who else is online to see if anyone else is in the group. Please feel free to put it in the chat box if you are and I've missed you. But that group, yes?
Hang on, we're having some technical difficulties, it looks like.
Uh-oh.
So take a quick look and see who else is on the ELAC group while we try to fix those.
Yeah, what's wrong?
All right, let's do a quick sound check. I've got several people saying they've lost sound or cannot hear. If you can hear, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm looking for raised hands if you can hear. Okay.
Yeah, we've
All
got
right,
raised hands.
I think we're good. All
Okay.
right, please continue.
So the ELAC, the English Language Advisory Council, is a way to have a voice. That group is a group where we at the state meet with those people and we say, here's what we're thinking about, let's say, the access cut scores. What are your thoughts? How can you advise us? And I believe it will be December when applications will be coming out for people to be involved at that level. That group meets several times a year and is our voice. It's a voice from the districts. It's a voice to us at the state to help us make those kinds of decisions. So those are just a few answers, and I will make a note to share the NELPA information with you all and maybe get it up on the Canvas site as well.
Yes, and we're seeing several people who said they lost sound for a bit and couldn't hear the organization's names, but like we said, we're going to add those to our course, so that's no problem. They'll be there for you to research and look at. A couple other things before we move on here to our next question. We need to address some technical issues, it looks like. So if you're ever having a problem with sound, with audio, I always encourage you to make sure that you shut down anything you're not currently using. So if you've got your email up in the background or something like that, close that out, because when we're broadcasting, when you're listening to a broadcast, whatever you've got happening on your computer is impacting how fast your computer can run, especially if it's connected to the internet. Even if you're not using it at the time, your computer's still working on it. So shutting out everything else besides just what you need for our discussion is always a good practice.
Trying to see if I can close anything.
Yeah. If you're having trouble, sometimes what you can do is go from computer audio to a phone call and then back to computer audio. Sometimes that will reset your audio and that will help. You can also unplug and replug your headsets to whatever device you've got. And I would always encourage you to be cautious about which browser you log into the meeting with. It's usually best to use a browser like Firefox or Safari. We find that people report the best results with those particular browsers. And browsers and things connections do vary, of course, by device. We've got one person with a technical question about how they're having trouble seeing the graphics on the screen. You can, of course, make your screen larger. You can maximize your screen and what we're broadcasting. We do know that some of the graphics are not necessarily crystal clear, but keep in mind, a lot of what we're showing on the screen is also in the course in Canvas. And so if you want to take a closer look or something wasn't quite clear during a broadcast, you can always go to that. In addition, we do post the slides from this broadcast just like we do the recording. And that's to help you have those resources, but it's also to help those who might be missing the broadcast and having to do the makeup assignment for the synchronous session. I think our technical problems are fixed.
Fantastic. And I know that the organizations are in one of our chapters coming up. We will go ahead and share it with you guys as a follow-up to this particular meeting, but we'll have a whole list of different organizations you might be interested in a future broadcast. All right, let's go on to our discussion about legislation and serving English learners. So I didn't know if anyone wanted to dig deeper into the legislation. I did add one piece here that is not included in the module, but it will be after today. Leandro versus North Carolina. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it very much follows the same guidelines as the other legislation that you see here. And so, but it's a North Carolina specific case where they talked about low wealth and funding for the districts, and that it's important for all students to have the opportunity to receive a sound basic education. And so that definitely impacted the English learners across the state. So I gave you a hyperlink to that one. So when this is posted, you'll have that, but I will add it to the Canvas course as well. So do we have any legislation geeks on here? I think the chapter does a very nice job of really boiling down these cases. And often when we have questions from the field about specific things, especially if it's related to Title III, the answer is often, well, that's actually in Title VI. And so very often when we're talking about our EL learners, those of you that work with the titles or the funding streams, Title III, they're digging through the legislation in Title III. Where's the answer? Where's the answer? Where's the answer? The answer actually often comes from Title VI because Title III is supplemental. Title VI, Office of Civil Rights, really goes through what our rights are, and so many things really flow from Title VI. If you've never sat down and read through it, it's a lovely read. I encourage you all to take a look at it. And I can tell I'm not talking to a lot of legislative geeks here, so that's okay.
One thing I would say about, digging deeper into our legislation and knowing what court cases and policies back the kinds of things we're doing in education is that knowing the legislation and using that information in your work is a good opportunity to educate people. Sometimes people approach legislation like this and say, it's going to be used to like punish someone or to say, I got you doing something wrong, right? Mm-hmm. But it's really an opportunity to educate people about how we want to serve students based on these past cases that you see or based on current policy like Title VI and things. So consider when you're thinking about the legislation, how can you use that to educate others about what we do in helping students learn languages?
And pages 10 and 11, again, are a really nice summary. It's one of the places where I feel like the authors did a really nice job of boiling it down and just putting it out there. And if you've taken the praxis, you've been exposed to all of these before as well, the EL praxis. Great, let me see if there are any hands up before we move on. Gabriela. Can you hear us?
Me?
Yes.
Well, I find myself showing or talking or discussing legislation with some teachers in terms of why do you have to meet with me? Why do you have to follow accommodations in the classroom, and try to educate them? This is not just optional, but this is a right that the student has, and these are the laws that that protect the student from receiving certain services or modifications or accommodations, and also for helping parents, especially parents who don't know the law or parents that are new to the country, and try to show them what their rights are and what type of services they're entitled to, and what type of help we can provide the students who are English language learners. So basically, I think those are the most common times where I see myself pulling out legislation and talking about Equal Education Opportunity Act or 14th Amendment or any kind of legislation, and trying to update myself on what is going on in the state, what has changed, what is new, what is different. So those are the two cases where I see it, that I find myself going through the law in terms of how I can best service the students.
Thank you. So a kind of advocacy and education, because so often people don't know what their rights are. And we know that with things like special education, parents may be very active in fighting for the rights of their students, but for a number of different reasons, our EL families may not do the same. All right, well, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So looking at Chapter 2 specifically, how have you analyzed the effectiveness of your current programs and practices, and what were the results and resolutions? So just a reminder, we are recording, so please share any frustrations in a respectful manner. And then also, what have the first 2 chapters sparked in your mind in relation to meeting the needs of ELs? So these 2 questions really tie together. How have you analyzed what you're doing? How are you looking at your data? And then what are you going to do no matter what that data said? Even if your data came out great, what are you going to continue doing, or what are you going to do if you need to make improvements? And some of you have touched on this already. Sandra has her hand up. I'm trying to unmute her. There we go. Sandra? If you're talking, we can't hear you, Sandra.
And this is Sandra Brighton, by the way. We have a
thank
couple
you.
of
We do have several Sandras, don't we? Okay, Sandra Brighton, I have you unmuted, but I'm still not able to hear you. So if you want to go ahead and type in the text box, I'm sorry that we're not able to hear you. If you have a headphone, maybe unplug it and replug it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and remute her for now.
We are getting some responses in the question box. Martha said she thinks we need to continue raising awareness that English learners are the responsibility of the entire school community, not just ESL teachers.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a response to the question about what have the first 2 chapters sparked in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Emily shared that she just received her book this afternoon, and so she's looking forward to reading the 2 chapters to be able to answer that question.
Awesome. And that is part of why in some of our poll questions, we gave you the option of, I'm not sure, but I certainly want to learn more. Because we know that those books have gone out and mail takes different lengths of time to get there. But you'll have a really good idea of what's to come if you're just getting your book and just getting able to dig into that information.
And we have a couple of responses to, analyzing the effectiveness of programs, looking at results and resolutions. Catherine noted that as an EL team, they're constantly evaluating access scores, making service decisions based on our district LIEP, and they're in constant conversation with teachers and weekly PLCs and working to implement a monitoring process to adjust what they're doing for English learners.
Great, and one of the things that we're working on here at the state, I keep mentioning MTSS, and that's because eventually everyone in the state should be involved in working with MTSS. And so one of the things we've been working on here is for the self-assessment of MCSS, having some EL considerations that people can look at and say, yes, we're looking at all students, but sometimes if you don't know what specific questions to ask about your ELs, or maybe you don't have an EL specialist on that team at the school, having some guiding questions that can help our schools drill down even deeper into how can they make sure that within meeting that 80%, that they're meeting 80% of that subgroup as well. And so that's something we hope to be releasing to the field either next semester or by the beginning of next year. We did share it with our EL coordinators and are hoping to be able to share that with all of you so that you can be thinking about ways to advocate for your ELs at your schools.
Elizabeth noted that it seems to her sometimes that the EL program is or was cobbled together, sometimes a reaction to new legislation, or often reacting to budget concerns and changes. She thinks this course may provoke her to look into the whole picture in her district rather than just her school.
All right, very interesting. And another one of our upcoming chapters talks about the LIEP, or the Language Instruction Educational Plan, which hopefully keeps it from just being thrown together, but really looked at a district level of how they're going to run the programs across the board and also within the charters. So you'll get to learn a little bit more about that as well.
We have several people commenting that they're new to their schools, and this gives them the opportunity to question how the English Learning Department is doing things, why decisions have been made by the principal or others, and why there's not a program with specific resources to serve the children that they have in the classroom. So this is a good opportunity to question and really find out what's happening.
Mm-hmm. And Shweta has her hand up. Let me unmute her. You're self-muted. No, so she's muted. There we go.
Yes, so I just wanted to say that, the current programs and practices are there at the state level, but I believe it may not be entirely implemented in its entirety at the charter schools or the independent school districts that are obviously accountable for their performance under ESSA and all that. So, I don't want to speak much, but I just want to say that there are definitely some deficiencies at the moment. And since I'm a part of this particular school, I can clearly tell you that there are things that need to be more in place. I do like the idea of being transparent and accountable, not just at the teacher level, the administrative level, and, even as far as even involving the parents. But I believe there are certain measures that need to be put in place to be able to be, serving with more effectiveness. When we have the MTSS, we have the language education plans, the EL plans for each and every student, and the criteria and the context. So it's so much that has to be done with its fidelity that you're not compromising on the effectiveness of the entire program and the practice.
Thank you. And I appreciate you acknowledging the fact that at the state, we do try to have very specific guidance in place or supports in place, because we are a local autonomy state, and how you choose to meet the guidance or requirements really is up to you. Some of you are aware we have EL coordinators in each of our districts and in each of our charter schools. And on September 18th, we had an all-day meeting just for our new coordinators to help bring them up to speed on all things compliance and program. The next day, we had an all coordinators meeting. And then the day after that, we had a breakout half-day session just for charters. So we really are trying to put in place supports and also give staff access to those people at DPI, not just in ESL, but in accountability and special ed. And if you go to the EL website under EL coordinators, there is a link to all of the materials from those meetings. And so those are public access, and you are welcome to look at that information. What do we have in the question box?
I have a couple more comments on the data that's being used to analyze programs. Sandra mentioned that the board looks at school report card subgroups, and this is challenging because this really focuses on integrated exams like ELGs, and often the subgroup is too small, so it doesn't populate in that particular data point. So that's a challenge. A lot of people who are using Access results to look at how their students are doing.
So I want to jump in about the sub-pop being, quote, too small. So because we have gone to the school level instead of the district level, sometimes our sub-pops are smaller, and the in size is 30 students in the tested grades in any of the tests. So if you've got someone in a tested grade taking 2 or 3 tests, then they're counting 3 times in that 30. But also realize an important piece of that puzzle is our English learners often are part of numerous subgroups. So even if your EL subgroup isn't large enough to be counted alone, very often these students are low income, maybe they're Hispanic, maybe they're EC. So in many cases, an EL student counts in numerous subgroups, which is even more reason to take the time to train our staff to meet the needs of these students.
There's some other people talking about how they handle things at their school level to get everyone connected. Rachel said that they're in constant conversation with teachers to help English learners. Their community is small, so they try to be in close touch with teachers and parents about the kids and ways to help them the best. We also have a couple people saying that they're actually taking this course, this book study, because they want to learn more. They know there's more they need to know to serve their students and to analyze the programs they have and what they could do better, and that's why they're here.
Fantastic. Well, I see we have 10 minutes left. Should we move on? All right, so if you want to keep talking about that topic, you can. But if you have other questions or thoughts, oops, that should say chapter 2, about chapter 2, not chapter 1. Sorry about that typo. If there's anything else you'd like to talk about, anything else you'd like to share, anything else you'd like to ask so far as we've gotten 2 chapters into our book study. And another thing to think about here is also all the introductions and getting to know each other. This is a great opportunity for you as well to make connections with each other when you go back in and look at what other people have done.
So let's think about what other questions or thoughts you have about this chapter 2 or module 3. We have a couple people who've been commenting about how you deal with things like the current political climate. And depending on where you're at and the community you're in, that political climate can mean a lot of different things. We've got several people commenting about, how do they use, for example, the legislation we talked about. Plyer versus Doe, for example, to protect their English learners. How do they work with people who are undocumented as families or are perceived to be undocumented, and how they help them understand that their children can be educated in the public schools and get them into a position where they are comfortable doing that and making connections with the school. We want all of our parents, of course, to be involved in children's education. And that can be challenging in certain political environments. It can also be a linguistic challenge. We heard that teachers are sometimes brought in as translators and interpreters because we know we want to reach out to our parents, but there's also only so much we can do as individuals. And so how do we solve those questions?
And one of the things that ESSA did as well is it requires family and community engagement for our EL families. So under Title I, many of our families have been involved under that legislation, but Title III under ESSA actually requires family and community engagement. So it's not just that they're involved, but they're engaged. And that's something that we're continuing to work on here at the state level. We have what's called the EL support team that does training around the state. And some of you may have attended our summer training this year, but we had a brand new course about family and community engagement. And we're working on turning that into modules that will be accessible to you all in a self-paced way, and maybe even done like we're doing now, where we can have synchronous sessions as well. But that's a piece of the puzzle that's new under ESSA that I think will be helpful in the climate you're talking about, just really actually having, again, some legislation behind what you're saying. No matter what the legislation says, people are going to make choices that they make. But if you're educated and have that information, and as someone said earlier, even educating your families that these laws exist, then that is one of the ways to work within that environment. So thank you for asking the question. I bet we can have a lot more discussion on that, and you guys can continue, as I was saying earlier, you know, you're networking with each other within the Canvas courses. You certainly can talk with each other online or offline to continue the discussions that we bring up here today. Do we have any other?
We have some thinking questions. We've talked a lot about how accountability is an issue with NCLB and now with ESSA. And so Liz says, what are some other differences between NCLB and ESSA beyond accountability? It's always something for us to think about. We've mentioned some here this afternoon, but also keep in mind that the ESSA plan for North Carolina is linked in our course. It's on the homepage. So if you really want to take a deeper look at that, you could go right to that information. It is quite extensive, we'll tell you that. And it certainly involves information about the education of many children, not just students who are English learners, of course.
And it's linked in the connections in this chapter as well. And the family and community engagement is one of the pieces that is different in that puzzle as well. And it's not a difference, but it's an important piece of the puzzle is that the professional learning, the professional development should be sustainable. It's not a one-time shot. And so that's, again, something that we at the state try to provide for all of you, is the opportunity for professional learning that is sustainable, that's not just once, but you can come back to it. You can go deeper with the different things that we offer. So the professional learning is an important part. And as Anne-Marie said, if you want to get in there and read about it, there's a lot of information that is in there. But accountability is a big part of the ESSA plan.
We have another question that has many answers. This person said, could our current governments, whether those governments are local, state, federal, etc., could our current governments get rid of past legislation that protects students? Well, there's no way to tell what may happen in the future or not. But again, understanding what legislation currently exists and what policies currently exist in state statutes, in local statutes, in federal law, that's always important to know what's there. And we would always recommend, as we do with our students as educators, stay informed. And so there are ways to get information. We've just talked about getting more information about the ESSA plan because that's posted and you can go in and read it. But there are things like newsletters, particularly on our North Carolina legislation. One of the things that we offer here at NCDPI is a series of listservs where you can get information on all kinds of topics. You're probably most familiar with things like the Teachers of English Learners listserv, the Dual Language Immersion Educators listserv, World Languages listserv, some of those that you've had from us. But keep in mind there are other listservs available, including one on K-12 legislation that's put out regularly. There are ones on different levels of education. So there are listservs for things like charter schools and for principals and for superintendents. There's information about our State Board of Education that takes our state legislation and puts it into policy for us to implement as educators. And so there are ways to get information about the policies and the laws and things that they're working with that do protect our students and also give us a way to think about how we serve our students. So, I mean, there are simple things like how do we implement the standards effectively for all students in all areas, but there are other things too that look at serving students and making different kinds of programs available at all of those governmental levels that you can be informed about.
And as a WIDA state, we at DPI are involved on different committees that are part of WIDA, Professional Learning Committee, Special Education for ELS Committee, and we have a group called the National Policy Subcommittee that I actually sit on. And so we are able to take concerns from North Carolina, concerns from other states, bring them together and talk about what kind of white papers might we need to write. If something's happening with legislation, what might we need to write to say that WIDA as a consortium supports something or encourages something. So that's another way that you have a voice, is by talking to us here at the state, because then we are able to have a voice through the WIDA consortium. All right, well, I'm keeping an eye on our time, so I'm going to go to our final poll question. So we want to know what you thought of this second synchronous session. You can choose as many of these as apply, that this strengthened your comfort level in exploring EL education. It encouraged you to dig deeper into the chapter or module. Maybe it helped you analyze EL legislation more closely, or excited you about what's to come. And did it generate insightful discussion among participants? So we'll give you a few seconds to answer that poll.
All right, we are getting faster at voting, so go ahead and put in your last votes on this poll. We will be able to finish on time today. Let's take 10 more seconds. All right, we'll close it out and share out. And everything, of course, this goes over 100% total because you could vote on multiple things, but it looks like you feel like, a majority of people feel like that this session helped them analyze that legislation more closely, strengthened your comfort level with the group exploring these topics, excited you for the next chapters in discussion, generate some insightful discussion amongst us, and also encourage you to dig deeper into the chapter. So that's great news. And so we'll continue on with our book study so that you can continue reading.
And if you have ideas, the 46% of you that didn't really feel that it strengthened your comfort, even though that was because you were 100% comfortable already, or if you have ideas on things we can do to help you feel even more comfortable in this format, we would greatly appreciate your input.
All right, well, let's wrap up today talking about a little bit of grading. We've already had one synchronous session. Now we're finishing our second one. We want to talk to you about grading the synchronous sessions. As you know, both the 1 CEU section and the 2 CEU section get a grade for the synchronous sessions. It's 10 points. It is based on attendance and participation, your responses to poll questions, and how much you participate in general in our discussions and questions that we put here. If you ever need to make those up, there is a makeup assignment for each synchronous session within our Canvas course. You can go to that. And I will tell you that we went ahead and posted grades for the first synchronous session as of 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. So if you did participate last time, or if you've done the makeup assignment for session number 1, your grade is already posted if you had it turned in by 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. You do still have some more time on the makeup assignment, so don't worry about that. Some of you I know are still getting into Canvas right now and getting enrolled so that you can access everything in Canvas. So if you don't see your grade there yet, that may be why, but that's okay. There's plenty of time for that too. Also, for our participants in the 2 CEU section, don't forget that in addition, you have reflection questions to do for each chapter in the Canvas course and a quiz on each chapter, a reading quiz that's really focused on comprehension. And it includes everything you read, not just the book, but also those state and national connections. So be sure you do that. The quiz, by the way, is self-scoring. And so you'll see right away what your grade is on that.
And is there more than one option to take the quiz?
Oh, yes, there is. You can take the quiz up to 2 times. And after twice, your highest score is recorded and you get the answers and so forth to make sure that you understood everything. There's also notes about where you can find those answers in our reading if you want that extra guidance. Oh, I do see somebody saying they just got the book kind of late, and the chapter 2 assignments will be late. Is that okay? Yes, we do understand, especially here at the beginning, that there may be some delays because of those logistical things. Please don't worry about that. The deadlines we have on the syllabus are really more to help you stay on track and not get overwhelmed by a lot of work piling up on you as you also teach during the day.
And they're also there to help keep us on track as we go in and review and grade and things like that, so that we don't have to do it all in the last day.
So do check those due dates and keep in mind that there is flexibility there, but they're there to help you as much as to help us with grading. All right, so that's it for today. Next up, our next steps are that we're going to go into Module 5 and be reading Chapter 3. We're actually getting ready to unveil everything through Chapter 4 and through our break, basically in synchronous sessions, so that you can work ahead if you want to, even if you get to that point. But remember that it's readings for everyone as far as the chapters go, quizzes for the participants in the 2 CEU section, and a discussion forum for the people in the 2 CEU section as well. Try to have all that done for Chapter 3 before our next synchronous session next Tuesday, October 15th at the same time, 4 o'clock to 5:30 p.m.
And those of you that are catching up and maybe weren't able to participate as much as you wanted to today, remember, as we said, it all ties together. So things that you had questions about or that come up as you read, you'll have the opportunity to share in the next synchronous session. And we'll only be looking at one chapter next time, but there's a lot to look at in that chapter. I think that's it.
Yep. Have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you next week.